This is now starting in November. Putin is describing Ukraine as an existential threat to the Russian Federation. And he says it, and he says he means it. It means if this Ukraine problem isn't resolved, it's a threat to the continuing existence of the Russian state.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of GNSI's Video Series. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Today, we're joined by Ambassador John J. Sullivan. He's the former Deputy Secretary of State, as well as the former ambassador to the Russian Federation from February 2020 until September 2022. He is currently the partner at Mayor Brown's Washington, D.C. and New York offices. He's also a distinguished scholar at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a distinguished fellow at Columbia University. Today, we will discuss his recently published book, Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. So we have the last in-person meeting of Biden and Putin, June in Geneva, 2021. Again, the Russians had this build-up. The meeting, they don't talk about Ukraine that much. So from your sense, no one's really worried about the specter of a major Russian invasion of Ukraine at that point. Just a month later, Putin publishes his now famous article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, claiming that Ukrainians are part of the Russian sphere, they're part of the Russian people. And then the U.S. has its withdrawal from Afghanistan, which you note in the book. Patrushev, who's a leading Russian official within the Putin circle, notes that with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the U.S. would eventually desert Ukraine like it deserted its Russian allies, or its Afghanistan allies.
Right.
So it's, in a sense, your ambassador, you're on the ground now. Are you seeing this trend towards the Russians maybe seeing the U.S. as not committed, or what? I mean,
looking back on it now, it's clear. I believe, my personal opinion, Putin had already decided in June of 2021 that he was going to accomplish what he later said were his war aims of denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. He didn't need to talk to the American president about that. And here's one of the tells, I think, is the president, our president and Putin don't discuss Ukraine at their meeting. Mm-hmm. They do separate press conferences, Putin first, then Biden, to talk about U.S. Russia relations. Putin goes first. The very first question for Putin from Russian state media, I forget, Izvestia, I forget. And that means it's Putin asking himself this question was, and I paraphrase, Ukraine is the most important issue to all Russians. What did you discuss with President Biden about Ukraine? And Putin says, Biden says the Ukrainians should comply with the Minsk agreements. We think that's the right strategy, but we didn't really talk about it very much. I hope the Americans convince their vassal in Kyiv to comply with the Minsk agreements. And then they go on. President Biden then gives a separate press conference after Putin lists, I think it's 11 things that he talked about, cyber, election interference, right? And number 10, not even a complete sentence, a sentence fragment was in his statement was when we discussed, continuing implementation of the Minsk agreements in Ukraine. Less than a month later, Putin writes that article. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Patrushev interview. By the end of October, now the president and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense are being told Putin's going to invade Russia. Mm-hmm. That was July, August. That was 3 or 4 months before. It was hardly discussed when Putin had the opportunity to discuss this with Biden. Mm-hmm. This is now starting in November. Putin is describing Ukraine as an existential threat to the Russian Federation. And he says it, and he says he means it. It means if this Ukraine problem isn't resolved, it's a threat to the continuing existence of the Russian state.
Right. Yeah.
It's a pretty bold statement for a matter that wasn't worth even mentioning. Never said that to Biden in June. So as I look back on the series of events from the spring of 21 up to the start of the special military operation in February of 22, February 24th of 2022, I believe Putin had decided before he had met with Biden. Now, we can debate whether he was, whether he was actually going to do the full-scale invasion that he did or not. I believe he was planning to. What I think the evidence would show is either by military force, what the Russians call military technical means, or by Ukrainian capitulation based on Russian threats, or convincing the United States to pressure the Ukrainians to submit to the Russian demands. Putin had decided he'd waited long enough. He was going to achieve his aims in Ukraine, demilitarize Ukraine, and denazify Ukraine. Denazify means removing the government in Kyiv, and demilitarize means taking the Ukrainian armed forces and drastically reducing their numbers and making them a constabulary force. He was going to accomplish that either by Ukrainian capitulation or an invasion. And I believe by the summer of 2021, he was full bore going to invade Ukraine unless the Ukrainians capitulated. And they didn't, and they fought back successfully. And we're now in the stalemate we see today in April of 2025.
So as the ambassador in that time, so you're looking at October of 21, as you mentioned, right? The Russians start building up on the border again, bigger numbers, more equipment. They're bringing stuff like blood forward, things that you would not typically do for just a training exercise. And again, like you noted, there's really nothing deterring them. We see they see weakness with the Afghanistan pullout.
Right.
And we see a couple interviews with the president, Jake Sullivan, noting that if Putin invades, the U.S. is going to sanction them with economics.
So President Biden sent Bill Burns, who was then director of Central Intelligence, to Moscow to meet with Putin and senior Russian leaders at the beginning of November. I happened to be home in Washington on leave, so I actually flew with the director to Moscow, and that's the message that Director Burns delivered. Don't invade. We see what you're going to do. Don't invade. The consequences for Russia will be catastrophic, crippling the Russian economy. It will be nothing like what happened in 2014-15 when you seized Crimea and moved into the Donbass. Don't do it. I think others in those meetings were pretty convinced that they were going to do it. They were not cowed or impressed by the threat of even the most severe U.S. economic sanctions. We had a meeting with Nikolai Patrushev, you mentioned. He was at that point the secretary of the Russian Security Council, in effect the equivalent to the National Security Advisor in the White House. He very close to Putin. They went back to early days in the KGB together in Leningrad. Very close, hardline Russian nationalist. And Patrushev said to Burns, in effect, the Russian Federation isn't the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. The economic sanctions really hurt us. They're illegal. They really hurt us, but we can survive. But our military, Russia's military, we've invested a lot in and have built up our military. And we're not going to invade Ukraine, but if there's a problem in our neighborhood, we can take care of it.
So do you think anything could have deterred the Russians at that point? I mean,
The only thing that would have stopped would have been Ukrainian capitulation
Mm.
to Moscow's terms, which at that point were. I've often thought about this hypothetical. If on February 23rd, Putin were offered the following: you will not seize any new territory in Ukraine, but Ukraine will enter into a union state relationship with Russia, similar to the union state relationship between Belarus and Russia. So Belarus and Russia, Lukashenko and Putin, the two countries have what's known, they call it the union state. If Ukraine were, and Belarus is, to use an English word that the Russians really like, Belarus is a vassal of Moscow, is controlled by Moscow. If Moscow were given control over Kyiv, if Ukraine joined the union state with Belarus and Russia, would Putin have still invaded? Maybe not.
Right.
Now, however, having lost huge numbers of personnel, being and incorporated now those oblasts, in addition to Crimea, into the Russian Federation, Putin can't surrender that territory. So I guess I'm drawing the distinction between before the invasion started and the huge Russian losses incurred to capture the 20% of Ukraine that they now control, having then had these fraudulent votes, plebiscites in those Ukrainian territories, oblasts, with the result being a vote to join the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation then incorporating them into the territory of the country. And finally, the Russian Constitution being amended in January of 2020 to make it unconstitutional for any Russian leader to separate any Russian territory, to give it away. He can never give away that territory, particularly given the losses that Russia has suffered to capture it. But I don't think his most important war aim, I guess this is my point, his most important war aim was not capturing 20% of Ukraine, the Ukrainian territory that they now control. It was getting control over Ukraine, over Kyiv, restoring control to what the Russians call the center, to Moscow, the way they did in Soviet days over all of the Soviet republics. Yeah, there was a Ukrainian Soviet republic. There was a border that separated the Ukrainian SSR from the Russian republic, but that wasn't an international border. Moscow still exercised control, and that's what Putin, I believe, really wants, and he can't tolerate a democratically elected government in Kyiv that is westward leaning and wants to join not only NATO but the EU.
So, how did you find out that the invasion started? You're in Moscow at the embassy.
So it was I think I'm going to get the dates right. So there was a crescendo of a buildup starting on Monday. I think the 24th was a Thursday. It starts on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, a succession of events, as I lay out in the book, of separatist leaders in the Donbass supported by Russia asking for military assistance to defend themselves because the Ukrainians were going to invade. There was a succession of events Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That week, I didn't know which day, and maybe it wouldn't even be that week. Maybe it would be the following Monday, but it was coming one of those days. We knew it. The Russians, Putin met with Xi at the opening ceremony for the Olympics. Our speculation was, I think Jake Sullivan was quoted, that the Russians are likely to do something, but probably not while the Olympic Games are ongoing. Xi's big project promoting the PRC through the Olympics. The Olympics had ended. Putin was taking all these actions in Moscow, threatening. So we had a 24-hour watch at the embassy so that we would get the word out if it happened in the middle of the night, as we expected, and as it did occur, to come into the chancery and begin engaging with Washington, which is exactly what happened. So that was early in the morning on Thursday, like 2:00 in the morning, and I was at my residence, the chief of mission residence, when I got a call that said, yeah, the invasion started. But it wasn't a surprise.
So what changed in Moscow and also in your role as ambassador after the war started? I mean, obviously now you're in a country that's
right,
a belligerent.
So we had, in the run-up to the war, in the weeks, that's a great question. The run-up to the war, we had a lot of, they're called, in State Department parlance at an embassy, Emergency Action Committee, which is if there's a crisis, a security problem, a health issue, the so-called EAC meets. It's in effect country team, the leadership of the embassy, not just the State Department, the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, the political chief, the econ chief, but the heads of all the U.S. other government agencies that are represented. So the senior defense official, the defense attaché, the station chief, the FBI senior special agent, the legat. We were all meeting to discuss. We knew that this war was going to start, and we wanted to be prepared to defend ourselves. Do we evacuate dependents? All of that preparation for the war. And would there be protests? Would the Russians close the embassy? Would the Russians expel me? All of these contingencies that we were planning for. Would our kids be able, the children at the embassy, continue to be able to go to school at the Anglo-American school, which was quite a distance from the embassy compound? Big protests, violence outside the embassy. All of these plans, all of these contingencies we were worried about. The invasion kicks off, and there was nothing. It was quiet.
Almost like business as usual?
No protests, business as usual.
Wow.
There was an occasional, solitary protester wearing the so-called St. George's ribbon with a sign standing outside the old embassy building on the Ring Road. But now, engagement with the Russian government basically stopped. So no routine engagement with the Russian government at that point. So that changed. But we would send folks out just for walks and drives around Moscow. And there weren't unusual troop movements in Moscow. There were, as I think I mentioned at the outset, there were luxury goods stores closed, particularly those around the Kremlin. But even then, it was done very subtly. The lights were left on, the doors were locked, and a discreet sign was put up that said they were closed. But it was not. It was hard to tell that there was a war going on.
What are you doing as ambassador if no one's willing to meet with you? Are you just preparing contingencies? How does that work?
So, so we are the reporting. So we are keeping track of what the Russian government is doing and saying and reporting back to Washington. Now, I'm not going into meetings with my usual counterpart, the deputy foreign minister, but we were paying careful attention to translating, Russian social media, Russian state media statement, and so forth, and reporting back to Washington on what we're seeing in Moscow. We were not at that point, and before the war started, and even after it started. I can't recall any significant concern which arose later after I left of drone strikes on Moscow. I was saying to Moscow, we're hundreds of miles from the front lines. I mean, we're not. It's not our security isn't threatened by the war in Ukraine. Our security is threatened only if the Russians want to allow something to happen to us domestically in Moscow. That changed after I had left. The Prigozhin mutiny, when there's armored troops from this private military contractor that we used to call Wagner, shooting down Russian helicopters. They're on the march from Moscow. Now the U.S. embassy's got a little different security profile. That was that was not something in January, February, March of 22 that we were worried about.
Very interesting. So how did as your term wrapped up and you came home finishing up your tenure as an ambassador, what were the final issues you handed over to eventually your successor?
Yeah, so things really changed. So it was, we didn't have much engagement with the Russian government, occasional meetings, March, April, May, June. Over the summer of 22, as bad as the relationship was between the United States and Russia, and I'm focusing more on, what's the right way to put this? How petty and hostile they were toward the embassy, the FSB. The pressure ratcheted up a little bit. I'll give you, I think I cite these examples in the book. There were more protests starting in the summer, late summer and early fall of 22. They renamed a street corner near the embassy to I think they originally wanted to call it something like Heroic Defenders of the Donbass Square. And then I issued a press release that said, because they're doing this to provoke us and to try to embarrass. And I said, well, we'd be honored to have a square named after those brave Ukrainian defenders of the Donbass who were fighting Russians there. Yeah. And then they changed it to, I forget. We, the United States, not the U.S. government, not the State Department, but we will rename the embassy, the street outside the Russian embassy. It's been renamed, Boris Nemtsov Way, a Russian opposition leader was. So we do the same things to them, but it changed they increased the number of provocations like that in the summer and early fall of 22. And when I left in September of 22, retired in October, my successor arrived in January, Lynn Tracy. Lynn, terrific career officer. Before that, she went to Moscow. She was ambassador to Armenia, had been the deputy chief of mission in Moscow. The Russians did things to her that they had never done to me. A couple of examples. She arrives, it was January. I left in September. January, she gets confirmed. She comes to Moscow. She arrives at night, goes to her residence, walks into the office. First day, power goes out across the compound. Remember I mentioned Moscow? There are no coincidences. The power goes out across the compound. Okay. She then goes that same day to present her credentials to the foreign ministry to get her little card that said she's the U.S. ambassador entitled to the diplomatic immunity. It's a fairly routine first meeting with the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there was a group of about 50 well-organized protesters with signs, both in English and in Russian, saying, the United States is a bloodthirsty, imperialist hegemon, blah, 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 all clearly organized. In 3 years, I never had a protest anywhere I went in Russia. So why does all this happen? In the summer of 22, this is my own theory. the Russians are finally starting to admit that the special military operation isn't going according to plan.
Right.
They've lost a lot of troops and equipment. It's when Prigozhin starts recruiting in the prisons.
Yeah.
Putin has to, I think it was September 18th, September 21st, announces a new round of what they called mobilization, but was more than mobilization. It's the first time he refers to what's happening in Ukraine as a war. And the international media said, aha, he's now admitted that he started a war. What he was saying was the U.S. and its vassals in NATO started a war in Ukraine against Russia, and the special military operation was our response to that. But it's the first time he ever calls it a war, as in real war. And that fall, the Russians collapse in and around Kharkiv. They get pushed out of Kherson. It's a really bleak time. August, September, October, November, December. Putin's language gets more threatening. He's making more, references to the nuclear weapons that the Russian Federation has. So I attribute what we started to notice in our bilateral relationship and how they treated the embassy coincided with the Russian government finally, never explicitly, but basically acknowledging that the special military operation didn't go according to plan. And he's got to mobilize troops. They've got to recruit. And by the way, we can talk about this. The prison recruitment scheme that Putin authorized, pretty brutal. That the special military operation was not a great success. He said that, interestingly enough, Putin, earlier on, I think it was March or April, the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was visiting Moscow, and he spoke to the press. He may have done this after he'd gotten back to Israel, and talking about his conversation with Putin. And he said, Putin said to him, yeah, the special military operation has encountered some problems. We weren't as good as we thought we were, we, the Russians, the Russian military. And the Ukrainians were tougher than we thought they would be. But it doesn't change our plans. It's just going to take longer. And by basically 4 or 5 months later, he's doing things that indicate to the Russian people, like, yeah, this isn't going according to plan. They said that when they withdrew from their, they wanted a blitzkrieg-like strike on Kyiv, when they actually then withdrew back into Belarus. How can you explain that other than a defeat? And, well, good faith gesture to encourage no Russian believes that.
Well, speaking of negotiations, as we look on today, and you looking from your experience in Russia with ongoing ceasefire talks, peace talks with the Russians, which might be called off. There's some speculation in the news that the U.S. might walk away from the table soon. What advice would you give with dealing with the Russians to the current diplomats and the policymakers engaging with them? Can we,
So this is my view is Putin will never compromise his war aims. His war aims, as he said consistently from the start, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. So denazify, remove the democratically elected government, and they say that Zelensky has now overstayed his term. It's no longer, there's no democratic legitimacy, etc. The Ukrainians have already decided that there's martial law. In any event, Putin wants to control the government in Kyiv, which he describes as basically a Nazi cabal, remove the government, and reduce the Ukrainian military, the armed forces of Ukraine, which is now, apart from the Russian Federation, probably the most capable and largest fighting force in Europe, if you compare it to any of our major NATO allies, Germany, France, the United Kingdom. The armed forces of Ukraine have become a very potent military. He wants that reduced from over 1 million to like 100,000 or 50,000. Mostly almost like a police. And having expended as many lives and as much treasure as he has, he's going to keep that territory in Ukraine that he has. He will never compromise that. And even if they freeze the conflict now along the line of contact, and I'm skeptical that he will. I'm skeptical that he would do it, and B, I am almost certain he would never do that if the line of contact included any territory in what was the Russian Federation on 2014 or February 24th, 2022, whether it's around Kursk or elsewhere. He would never freeze a front line there if the Ukrainians control any territory of what, under international law would be the Russian Federation. So it's the most important thing, I think, for the Ukrainians. It's less about, and you having served there yourself, you know better than I. It's in many ways less about immediately reclaiming the territory lost as opposed to security guarantees for Ukraine's future. And I was there. I was serving as deputy secretary when Secretary Pompeo drew a dotted line around Crimea and said, this is Ukrainian territory. And similar to what the United States did almost 100 years before with the Baltic countries, never conceding that they were absorbed by the Soviet Union. But everyone that I've spoken to, I don't know that there's anyone, including the most optimistic Ukrainians, who thinks that Ukraine is in a position anytime in the near future to expel Russia from Crimea, pushing the Russian forces out of the territory they've seized in the Donbass. I'm not a military expert, but I find it difficult to disagree with what seems to be the consensus that that's going to be a hard thing. Freezing the conflict. Look, who wants to see missiles hitting Ukrainian cities and killing innocent people, children? No one. So the violence stops, but the Ukrainians are going to have security guarantees because it's going to stop, and Russia is going to refit and rearm and regroup and just continue until Russia achieves Putin's war aims.
With that in mind, as negotiations go on, hopefully there's a solid peace that comes out of this, Ambassador. But thank you so much. The book Midnight in Moscow is excellent read. Really gives an interesting take on that firsthand perspective of the lead up to the current war in Ukraine. So thank you so much, Ambassador.
My pleasure.
What an intriguing episode of GNSI's video series. Today, we're joined by former Ambassador John J. Sullivan, who was the ambassador to Russia during the initial stages of that country's invasion of Ukraine. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer here with the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. Thank you for joining us today, and please tune in to our next episode of our video series.